As many of you guys know, we're actually in a season called Lent, which I mentioned earlier, and Lent is a season that's commemorated around the world by different Christians as we look towards resurrection. And next Sunday is Resurrection Sunday, where we celebrate this historical event that Christians found our faith on, that we believe that it was an actual event and a real person. It's not some kind of mythic kind of story, but it's something that's real and that we believe in, and that he was a historical figure. And so that's what Easter Sunday is. And just a quick heads up on what's happening here at our church for this week. Next Friday, or Good Friday, we'll be having a Good Friday service here at 7 o'clock p.m. We'll be joining Hope Westside as well as Hope East Village. We'll have it one big gathering here. And then on Easter Sunday, we're not having Hope Nights, which is our evening Sunday gathering that we started last week. Instead, we're actually going to do 3 morning gatherings right here, 9 o'clock, 10:30, as well as 12 o'clock p.m. with kids programs being available for the first 2 gatherings. So we'd love for you to come on out to that and invite someone new. Again, it's a great day to celebrate this historical event that we Christians basically say is the foundation of why we believe and what we believe. And so in the season of Lent, we've actually been looking at a Hebrew prophet named Habakkuk. Can I hear you say Habakkuk? That's right. Habakkuk is a minor prophet that around 612 BC, he was actually living, and he was in the midst of the southern kingdom of Israel during 612 BC. And he was crying out to God because around him, there's all sorts of injustice and violence that was happening around him. So he would cry out to God, God, where in the world are you? In the midst of suffering and difficulty. And if you're someone here, if you're a Christian, or even if you're not a Christian, and you've ever wrestled through questions about evil and suffering and death, this is actually the book for you, because Habakkuk is here and he's wondering these same things. Why is injustice happening? God, I thought you were God. How come violence is happening? When are you going to show up? And so as we've kind of waded through the book of Habakkuk chapter 1, what we looked at was this, it starts out with this lament, this wondering, these complaints to God. And in this amazing moment, people think that the religious experience is all about happy, happy, joy, joy. But no, like part of the religious experience and part of the human experience is that we lament, that there is grief that we carry at times. And so Habakkuk gives us freedom. He actually complains to God, God, where in the world are you? And God answers and says to Habakkuk, deliverance will come. I will answer your call for your laments, your pain. I will answer it, but I'll do it not in a way that you expect, but through Babylon. Now, back in those days, Babylon was the evil oppressor. And so, can you imagine this? Like Habakkuk is like, God, when are you going to show up? And God's like, don't worry, deliverance is going to come, but it's going to come through Babylon, through your oppressors. And we talked about the mystery of God, how sometimes he works in these ways that we don't quite understand. And then we talked about in Habakkuk chapter 2, where he talks about waiting for my deliverance, and how many of us, especially as impatient New Yorkers, we just have a hard time waiting, and how God says, no, deliverance will come, but you just have to wait. And then, of course, last week in the latter part of chapter 2, what we explored was how Habakkuk, God says, listen, I feel your pain, and he allows us to feel felt by calling out injustice. I care. He says he is the God of justice, and deliverance will come. Which brings us finally then to chapter 3, which is the last chapter in the book of Habakkuk, where now Habakkuk has come. So they've had this dialogue where Habakkuk complains. God says, this is how I'll deliver you. Habakkuk says, when are you going to do it? God says, you just have to wait. And by the way, I care. You have to know this, that I care about injustice, that I'm not just some aloof God who is distant, but that I'm actually close, and that I will deliver you. So finally, we come to this culminating chapter where Habakkuk now prays to God. Now check out what Habakkuk says. In Habakkuk chapter 3, this is what he says. He says, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, Lord, I have heard of your fame. Now, Habakkuk is saying this because, think about it, Habakkuk is in the midst of a trying time for his own people. He's wondering, God, where are you? When are you going to deliver us? And this is what he says to God, I have heard of your fame. In other words, your reputation precedes you. There have been stories after stories of your greatness and your deliverance. I've heard of your fame. He says, I stand in awe of your deeds, Lord. Repeat them in our day, in our time. Make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. So Habakkuk has been in this dialogue with God. He's gone back and forth. He's lifted and offered these laments. God has answered with mystery. God has answered with weight. God has answered with, I am just. And in the midst of it, this is what Habakkuk does. He basically says to God, God, I've heard of your fame. I've heard the stories. I've heard the stories of what you've done in the time of Moses. I've heard the stories of what you've done in the times of David. I've heard the stories of how you have delivered us. And this is what Habakkuk is doing. I mean, don't you get this? Like, have you ever been in this place before where you're kind of wrestling with God and you're like, God, I've heard what you've done before. Can you do it again? Will you show up again? Will you remember us in our day, in our time? Will you show yourself to be who you say you are? I mean, I love this prayer by Habakkuk because what Habakkuk is basically saying is this, is that our faith in God, our present and our future faith, is actually based on God's past faithfulness. Now notice, this is what Habakkuk says. He says, I've heard your deeds. I've heard of them. Your fame. Remember us. All the time when Habakkuk is saying these words, what he's basically saying is, God, I want you to show up. I want you to do it again the same ways that you've done it in the past. Will you come and will you remember mercy? Will you show up on our behalf? And what he's demonstrating is our faith in God is actually based on God's past faithfulness. That we as a people then can trust that God has been faithful in the past, and that's where we can hang our hat. And if we can do that, then we can live with faith into the future. There's actually this story that, even if you're not a Christian here, you may have heard this story before. It's about a young fellow named David and a giant named Goliath. Anyone heard this story before? Yeah, David and Goliath, and the rest of you are lying. And who are not raising your hands. And so David and Goliath, here they are, and David basically, he serendipitously kind of stumbles upon where these battle lines are being drawn, and he sees and he hears the taunts of Goliath. And Goliath, of course, is this giant representing the Philistines, taunting Israel and their God. And David's basically like this young shepherd boy, and David, he's kind of like, who is this cat who thinks he's all that? Wow, I didn't realize that was, anyhow, I thought that was clever. But anyhow, he's like, who is this guy? I cannot believe he taunts the God of Israel. How dare he do this? And, you know, the people of Israel, they're all scared of Goliath. And they're like, hey, listen, settle down, buddy. And he's like, no. How can this guy defy the gods of Israel? And then everyone's like, well, what are you going to do about it? And David's like, I'm going to fight him. And everyone's like, you're like this small shepherd boy. What in the world are you doing? Now, what's kind of lost in the story of David and Goliath, and you've probably heard the story, David takes his sling, he throws these rocks, these stones that hit Goliath, and then he falls and he defeats Goliath, this giant. But the reason that David gives to the people who are doubting him, the reason David gives for why he has what it takes to fight Goliath, David actually says, no, actually, as a shepherd, God delivered me from a lion and a bear. Like, what do you mean, David? Like, and he's like, oh yeah, like a lion, like I killed a lion before, and I killed a bear before, and it's this amazing moment where David is basically saying, like, don't you understand? The reason why I can have faith that God will deliver me is because I've taken down a lion and a bear. You don't know it, but I know what God can do. There's this moment where David, he founds his own faith on God's past faithfulness. And so what he's saying is, listen, God has delivered me from lions and bears when none of you saw this. And because of that, I know that Goliath is nothing before what God can do. And God can do it again. He founds it on the past faithfulness of God. Now, you know what's interesting, though, is that for the people of Israel, time and time again, they had actually seen miracle after miracle. God had moved in extraordinary ways. I mean, there's these stories of basically when Moses is leading the people, the Israelites, out of captivity, out of Egypt. He's leading them out, and they witnessed this. They witnessed the Red Sea be parted before them, and they witnessed going through the Red Sea. This was a miracle that they had all witnessed. Now, you know what's so interesting? Is that a few years later, as they're in the desert and in the wilderness, They're like, I can't believe God and Moses, you brought us out here to starve and to die of thirst here in the wilderness. I can't believe this. We should have been just kind of left in Egypt as slaves. And it's this remarkable moment where the very people who had been delivered before, somehow they've kind of forgotten this thing called the Red Sea. They've kind of forgotten this thing called Passover, these miracles where God had worked on their behalf. Now, here's the thing. Like, I know that for me, I am just as fickle. And oftentimes, when I see what's before me, I don't think and reflect upon God's past faithfulness. Instead, what I'm thinking about is my own insecurity, my own fears, and the things before me. And just like the Israelites, I can say to God, man, God, where are you? When are you going to show up? And God's like, hey, have you seen my past faithfulness? Have you seen the moments when I've shown up? Will you just look at the data? Now, a couple weeks ago, I shared this story about when I was dating Tina, and about 6 months in, I knew I wanted to marry her, and she wasn't sure. And so during the midst of that, she decided that she wanted to go work in Seoul, Korea at an NGO while we were still dating. And so here I am in New York, and I know I want to marry this woman, and she basically says to me, I'm not sure yet that I want to marry you. I'm going to go to Seoul. Peace. And so that hurt a lot. And so she ended up going to Seoul, and she started working at this NGO. And I shared this story about how while we were there, she would do her best because she knew how some of my insecurities would get the best of me, and how I would constantly, be wondering whether or not she was committed to this relationship and everything else. And I shared this story about how there was a holiday weekend in Seoul, and while I was here in New York, like the first day, she actually didn't contact me or call me or text me or respond to any of my messages, and how disorienting that was. Now, of course, during that time, here I am in New York, right? I've just got my phone there, and I act like I'm not checking the phone, but every time it buzzes, I'm like, oh my goodness, right? Like I go and I look and I see if it's her and it's not her, and then kind of just getting a little bit anxious, right? Like she's out in Korea, I'm just here in New York. And then I shared the story about how like a few days passed. After 3 or 4 days, I had been so convinced that she had left me, that she broke up with me, she had found another guy, and that she was going to get married to this other guy who was like some filmmaker who she told me about like 3 weeks ago. Like, because she hadn't called me. I mean, it was the craziest thing. Now, I mean, it's so funny because there in that very moment, my insecurities, my deepest fears, all of the worst parts of me in the midst of this situation. Now, here's the thing. In my dating relationship with Tina, all I found her to be, as well as being friends for 2 years prior to that, was that she was a woman of integrity, that she was a woman who basically would mean what she say what she means, sometimes too much, but nonetheless, no, I'm just kidding. She was someone with great integrity. And so here I am. All of the data of the past demonstrates that she's reliable, trustworthy, that something must have happened. And yet, all I could believe in that moment was my own insecurity, was my own fear, was my own hangups, was my own circumstances. And how often we do that with God. There's this data of faithfulness. God has moved on our behalf. He's done this and that in moments of desolation. He's worked in our relational lives before. He's worked when it comes to provision. He's worked when it comes to answering prayers that we long for him to answer. But our memories are so short, and just like me, I am driven not necessarily by God's faithfulness and his power, but instead by my own insecurities, by my own fears, not on solid data. You know what's interesting is Habakkuk, as he talks about this idea of remember God in his mercy. Remember, God, will you show us? I've heard of your fame and your deeds. Demonstrate them in our time, in our day. As he does this, notice what Habakkuk begins to talk about. He begins to talk about the things about God that we can put our hat on, that we can trust. Check out what he says. So Habakkuk, he says, his splendor was like the sunrise, So he talks about God's transcendence, being even over the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hand where his power was hidden. He stood and shook the earth. This is how big God is. He looked and made the nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled and the age-old hills collapsed. Were you angry with the rivers, Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the sea when you rode your horses and your chariots to victory? You uncovered your bow. You called for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. I mean, do you see what Habakkuk is doing? He's painting this picture of how enormous and strong and powerful and how great God is. He says, the mountains saw you and writhed. Torrents of water swept by. The deep roared and lifted its waves on high. Sun and moon stood still in the heavens, because this is who you are. At the glint of your flying arrows, at the lightning of your flashing spear, in wrath you strode through the earth, and in anger you threshed the nations. You came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. You crushed the leader of the land of wickedness. I mean, do you see what Habakkuk is doing here? He's saying, God, we've heard of your fame. We stand in awe of your deeds. Remember them in our day, in our time, because this is who I believe you to be. He doesn't even bring out specific events. Instead, he talks about the significant greatness of God. That God is over the sunrise, that God is over the rivers, that God is over the seas, that God is over any nation state, that God is greater than any government. Like this is what he's saying. Habakkuk is basically saying, God, we've heard of your fame and your deeds, and I'm gonna hearken back to the very thing that defines you as being God, which is because you're God, you're over the sunrise, you're over the seas, you're over the rivers. You're over everything. And because I know that you are God over everything. Now, one of the ideas that we talked about last week when we talked about justice is what Habakkuk is hearkening back to is this idea that God is so transcendent and big. And maybe you're here today and you're probably like, I'm not even a Christian. But here's what I believe we can agree to. Even if you're not a Christian or if you're not religious, all of us can likely agree that if there was a God, that what we would believe about this God is that he was bigger and stronger than any human being or any nation or any government or any one person, that this is who God is. And Friedrich Nietzsche, who's a German philosopher in the late 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche, who's influenced so much of Western philosophy, he would actually popularize a phrase that would be used time and time again as he looked at the landscape of morality and worldviews and Western thought. One of the things that he noticed was this trajectory away from believing in God and who God is and God as a moral center of the universe, and an elevation of humans and an elevation of kind of this humanism that elevated what human beings think about the world and how we define morality, et cetera, et cetera. And so someone actually sent me a t-shirt that has the phrase that Nietzsche would popularize, and it's this phrase, God is dead. Nietzsche said that in 1883, and he would actually write that in several of his other writings. And of course, Nietzsche was someone who, this brilliant mind who talked about how, the relevancy of God and who God is. God is dead. And so the person who sent me this t-shirt, it's like, ha, 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 you're a pastor, and God is dead. Yeah, it's funny. Not really. But anyhow, so here Nietzsche is, but on the other side of this t-shirt, it says this, Nietzsche is dead. God in 1900. Now, whatever your philosophical disposition is as you walked in today, like, can we just agree that if God exists and if he's real, like, he's bigger, stronger, more able than any one person in this room? And that if God is God, yeah, of course he'd be over the sunrise. Of course he'd be over the rivers. Of course he'd be over the seas. Of course. Because by definition, this is who God is. He is transcendent. He is big. He is able. And this is what Habakkuk is hearkening to. He's saying, God, remember us, and I know you can. I know you can do something. I know you can deliver us because you're the God of the universe. You're the God over the sunrise. You're the God who split the rivers. You're a God who can do this and that. And the reality is, every single one of us, you and I will die one day. Nietzsche has died, every single human being. We will die one day. Why? because we're not God. Only God is God. And if God exists, then of course, this God is so big and so strong. Of course, God is God and we are not. And what Habakkuk is hearkening to is, God, the bigness of who you are, the grandeur of who you are, the fact that you're over the sunrise, the fact that you're over the rivers and the seas. Because of all these things, you are God. Will you remember us? Because our faith is rooted in God's past faithfulness and God's greatness. Now, some of you might be in this room and you're probably even wondering, like, wait a minute. Okay, Drew, yes, God, of course, God is a great God. He's a big God. He's a transcendent God. But maybe that's not what I've been struggling with. And maybe what you have been struggling with, like many people throughout history, is not necessarily whether God is big and able, but is God kind and is he loving? And maybe you and I have been in this season where you've been wondering, like, God, like Habakkuk, you've been crying out and saying, God, when are you going to show up? There's a situation when it comes to provision where I need you to show up. There's a season perhaps that you're in with an illness where you're like, God, when are you going to show up? Or maybe you've been in a situation where, like, you've been battling with infertility and you're a couple and you've been longing for children and you're just wondering, God, when are you going to show up? Maybe there's been some relational conflict in your family and it feels like just a dark tunnel that can never be overcome. Maybe you're going through a season of depression or addiction and you just wonder, God, are you here? Can you really move? I know that that's the question that I've wrestled with time and time again. Okay, intellectually, I can somehow get to a place where I say, okay, if God is God and he's real, of course he's able. But how do I know that he's kind, that he's for me and not against me? You know, Habakkuk, as he's calling out, and he's had this back and forth with God, he's offered these laments. He's been told to wait. He's been told that God cares about injustice and violence and wants it to. And here Habakkuk is. He's saying, God, will you do it again? And as you do it again, I believe that you're great. I believe that you're strong. I believe that you're able. But if you notice, actually, in chapter 3, there are these moments where Habakkuk also gives us clues, not necessarily about the power of God, but about the kindness of God. Check out what Habakkuk, what he writes. He says, you trampled the sea with your horses. Again, he's talking about the greatness of God. You trampled the sea with your horses, churning the great waters. I heard and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound. In other words, it's this evidence that deliverance is coming, that God is going to show up in all of his might and splendor. Decay crept into my bones and my legs trembled. Now catch what Habakkuk says here. He says, yet, I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us. In other words, he's saying, yet I will wait patiently for your deliverance. Though the fig tree does not bud and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He enables me to tread on the heights. Here's what Habakkuk is doing. Now, if you can imagine, Habakkuk is not someone who, in his lifetime, all he's known is the suffering and violence around him. So he's been calling out to God. He's beseeching God to move on his behalf. And he's saying, God, I've heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. Remember us in our day, in our time. And in the midst of this, he talks about all these things, about God's deliverance. And in the midst of this, though, he looks around and he still sees that his life hasn't changed much. There's still the same suffering. There's still the same injustice. There's still the same violence. See, but there's this word that he uses. He says, yet I'm going to stick with you, God. yet I'm going to hold on to you. Yet I'm going to worship you. Yet I'm going to cling to you. Now, the only reason why Habakkuk would ever pray this is because he's trusting that not only is God great, but that God is kind and loving and gracious. And he would be holding on to this in the midst of the most difficult trials that he might face and the people that he's around might face. Now, you know what's so miraculous about the Christian story? See, the Christian story doesn't just tell us that yes, there is a God and this God is transcendent and big. The Christian story tells us that God, whenever we may have doubted his kindness, his goodness, his love for us, that God would actually take on flesh and come among us. And that Jesus would come into the world, who we believe to be God himself, to live this life, to sympathize with all of human experience and suffering and injustice, to live and to die on a cross. And why in the world would we believe that God does this? God doesn't need to do this. God is God. He can smite all of us with a snap of his finger. He can do whatever he wants. If this God who's over the sunrise, if this God who kind of splits the rivers, if this is who God is, why in the world would he do this? Why would he come to live and to die? Well, the Apostle Paul writes to the church in Rome. Check out what he writes about the nature of who God is. He says, God demonstrates his love for us in this. Why would Jesus come? It's because of his love. Because this is what love would compel him to do. And it says, God demonstrates his love for us in this. While we were yet, there's that word yet again. It's a Greek word eti. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. This word yet, while we were still, while we remained, while we were in the pit, while we were yet people who were apart from God, while we were yet in the darkness, while we were yet going through the valley of the shadow of death. It's in this. God comes through the person of Jesus to live and die on our behalf and to resurrect from the grave. And why in the world would God do this? It's because of his great love. To demonstrate to you and to me that whatever season you might find yourself in, whatever darkness you might be going through, whatever impossible obstacle might lie in your future, you can trust there's a God who is not only great, but a God who is kind and loving. One who'd be willing to give his life for you, to demonstrate to you and to me how deep and long and wide his love is for us. You know, I was, a few years ago, I was reading this sermon by a man who was terminally ill. He had terminal cancer, and he was a pastor and a preacher. And so he was actually preaching on this passage in Romans chapter 5, verse 8. And he was preaching on this idea that just kind of, I mean, can you imagine the craziness of this? God, the God of the universe, demonstrates his love for us. Like, he's not only big and aloof, he's actually big, and yet he's close and here. And his posture is one of being loving towards us. And he talks about the miracle of this. And he talks about how, but the elephant in the room in this sermon is, here's this man, though, who's going to die from cancer in a few months. And he talks about it in his sermon. And there's a phrase from the sermon that has always stayed with me. And the phrase was this. He would say, my hope is in eti. My hope is in eti. Now, eti, again, is a Greek word for yet. My hope is in eti. My hope is in the fact that even though I might see death square in the face, yet God's love is real. and his love is strong, and his love is for me. Though I might be going through a season right now, wrestling through my own anxieties, my own fears, whatever you've come into this room with today, and you have doubted the character of God, and you have wondered whether he is for you and not against you. Can I just say that, see, from a Christian perspective, when it comes to the data of God's past faithfulness, it's a story of unending, sacrificial love that would be willing to die on your behalf, that while you were in whatever predicament you're in, he would demonstrate to you and to me that his love is kind, his love is real, and his love is furious. My hope is in a T, that whatever I'm going through, that I can trust the God of the universe would give his very life for me. And because of that, I've got a living hope.